How could a prince of France be remembered with the monstrous name Cannibal Prince? The question alone is enough to chill the blood. But history ties it to a young monarch whose reign is forever stained by shadows. Paris, August 1572. The streets reek of iron and rot. Bodies of men, women, even children lying abandoned on the cobblestones. The bells of St. Bartholomew's Day had rung, not for worship, but for slaughter. And on a palace balcony, a pale figure stood above it all. Charles IX, only 22, watched with hollow eyes as the river of death ran red below him. Whispers began almost at once. They said the king had ordered the massacre, that he delighted in the sight of the blood. But darker whispers still crawled through the corridors of Europe, that Charles had not only commanded death, but had consumed it, tasting human flesh, drinking human blood, becoming not a king, but a cannibal. The rumor spread faster than any truth. It painted him not as a weak monarch caught in the tide of religious war, but as something less than human, a beast cloaked in velvet and crowned with gold. Was this terrifying tale born from the chaos of the massacre, a slanderous weapon forged by his enemies? Or was it a glimpse into the cracked mind of a ruler broken by violence, haunted by the screams that would never leave his nights? This is not just the story of a king. It is the descent of a boy raised in blood, a monarch consumed by the very horrors he unleashed. And it is also the story of how power can turn whispers into legacies darker than truth itself. Stay with us until the end, as we unravel whether the legend of the Cannibal Prince was a grotesque reality or a political curse. And if you wish to walk deeper into the darkest corridors of history, do not forget to subscribe to our channel so you never miss what lies hidden behind the throne. Charles was born in 1550, the third son of King Henry II of France and Catherine de Medici, a woman whose name would become synonymous with both influence and intrigue. From the very first breath he took inside the walls of the royal palace, Charles entered a world already fractured. France in the mid-16th century was not a land of stability. It was a nation trembling on the edge of collapse, torn apart by the brutal struggle between Catholics and the rising Protestant minority, known as the Huguenots. This conflict was not a distant battle fought on faraway fields. It was war brought to the doorsteps of families, dividing neighbors, setting entire cities ablaze. For a royal child, these were not abstract dangers. They were the background music of his upbringing, the sound of blades and sermons echoing through the corridors of power. Charles grew up in a dynasty that prided itself on divine right. Yet behind the glitter of the Valois crown lurked an atmosphere of constant suspicion. His elder brother, Francis II, had reigned only briefly before dying young, leaving the throne vulnerable. His other brother, the future Henry III, stood as both companion and rival. The boy who would become Charles IX was never allowed the innocence of childhood. When his father died in a tournament accident, the Valois dynasty lost more than a king. They lost stability. The crown passed swiftly to young Francis II, and after Francis's sudden death, it fell on the head of Charles, a child barely 10 years old. At an age when most children still stumble through lessons of reading and writing, Charles was crowned King of France. His small frame was cloaked in royal robes far too heavy for his shoulders, both literally and symbolically. It was in this vacuum of power that Catherine de Medici stepped forward. As Queen Mother, she became the regent and the true power behind the throne. Catherine was no ordinary woman of the Renaissance court. She was Italian by birth, raised in the shadow of the Medici banking dynasty, trained in the arts of survival in a Europe where courts devoured the weak. Her strength was not found in open battle, but in careful maneuvering, in whispers, in veiled threats. For her, Charles was both son and instrument, a vessel through which she could preserve the Valois line against the storm of religious war. Charles's formative years, therefore, were shaped less by personal freedom than by the hands that guided him. His mother's shadow loomed long, her influence both protective and suffocating. To the court, he was the boy king, a monarch in name but not in command. Ministers, generals, and ambassadors all knew that the true will of France resided in the Queen Mother's chambers. And Charles, still fragile in mind and body, learned to bend rather than to lead. The atmosphere around him was poisonous. Plots and assassinations were as common as banquets. Nobles whispered alliances in secret, and entire factions within the kingdom schemed either to uphold the Catholic majority or to expand the rights of the Huguenots. Charles grew up with the knowledge that any smile in court might hide a dagger. He lived in a palace adorned with gold but surrounded by blood, an environment where trust was a luxury that even kings could not afford. This constant climate of suspicion had consequences. Contemporary accounts describe him as nervous, easily swayed, prone to bursts of emotion followed by crippling indecision. He was described as impressionable, almost desperate for guidance, which made him especially vulnerable to the will of his mother, to Catherine. This weakness was both a curse and a gift. It allowed her to steer him where she wished, but it also exposed him to the crushing weight of decisions that no boy should ever face. Thus, the image of Charles IX that emerges from his youth is not of a confident monarch striding toward destiny, but of a child born into the dark womb of hatred and division. He was a king raised not by choice but by the accidents of death, a boy shaped more by fear than by hope. In his eyes, the throne was not a prize, it was a burden, one that would twist his mind and leave scars too deep to heal. It was this fragile foundation, laid in the violence of his childhood, that set the stage for the horrors to come. The world would one day remember Charles IX, not as the boy who inherited a troubled crown, but as the monarch who presided over one of the most infamous massacres in European history. And in that night of slaughter, his already fractured mind would descend into shadows from which it would never return. On the night of August 23rd, 1572, Paris fell into a silence that was not peace but anticipation. The city had been tense for weeks. Thousands of Huguenot nobles and their followers had gathered in the capital for the wedding of the Protestant leader Henry of Navarre to Margaret of Valois, the sister of King Charles IX. It was meant to be a union of reconciliation, a fragile bridge between Catholic and Protestant factions. But beneath the feasts and celebrations, suspicion roiled like storm clouds. Catherine de Medici and her council feared that Protestant influence over the king was growing too strong. Plans were whispered, blades sharpened, and before the sun would rise again, that bridge would be burned in fire and blood. When the bells of Saint-Germain-l'Auxerrois rang in the early hours, it was not for worship. It was the signal. Soldiers and Catholic militias surged through the streets with orders to kill. Windows were shattered, doors broken, and men dragged from their homes. The bloodletting began with Admiral Gaspard de Coligny, the Protestant leader and advisor to Charles, whose assassination was the spark that lit the inferno. Once his body was thrown into the streets, the slaughter spread with uncontrollable fury. For 3 days, Paris became a butcher's yard. By the time the killing ended, thousands lay dead. Eyewitnesses described corpses floating in the Seine. the river so choked with bodies that its waters seemed more red than blue. Neighbors turned on neighbors. Families were torn apart, and the cries of women and children echoed through alleyways where no rescue would come. Contemporary accounts estimated that as many as 3,000 Huguenots perished in Paris alone, while the violence spread to other cities in the weeks that followed, pushing the death toll into the tens of thousands. And at the center of it all was the young king. Many sources accuse Charles IX of giving the direct order for the massacre. Some chronicles claim he screamed in anger, declaring that not one Huguenot should be left alive in his kingdom. Others suggest that Catherine and her council pressured him into agreeing, presenting it as the only way to preserve the crown. Whether Charles commanded it with conviction or yielded under pressure, history has preserved him as the monarch whose signature unleashed the killing. Yet what came after may have been even darker than the massacre itself. Accounts of Charles IX in the months following St. Bartholomew's Day describe a man unraveling. Sleep abandoned him. He wandered the palace at night, haunted by the faces of the slain. Servants reported that he would burst into fits of trembling, screaming that the streets outside still ran with blood. He could not eat without nausea, and his body was racked by sudden convulsions. Some said he heard voices, the phantom cries of the dead, calling his name. One chilling anecdote survives from the period. It was said that Charles, in the grip of his torments, admitted that blood had become a part of him. He allegedly boasted of firing on fleeing Protestants from the windows of the Louvre, watching them fall like hunted prey. Whether this confession was truth, rumor, or political slander remains uncertain. What is clear is that the image of the young king was forever fused with the horrors of that night. To his enemies, he became less than human, a monarch consumed by the very carnage he had unleashed. The transformation was visible even to foreign ambassadors. Reports to foreign courts spoke of a king broken in body and spirit, coughing blood, his hands unsteady, his mind restless. The massacre had not brought him power or stability. Instead, it left him a prisoner of nightmares. Where once there had been a hesitant boy king, there now stood a haunted man, whose reign would never escape the echo of August 1572. This moment, this night, became the turning point of his life. The massacre did not just claim the lives of thousands of his subjects, it claimed the sanity of their king. From that night forward, Charles IX would be remembered less as a monarch and more as a shadow of one, a man whose crown was soaked in blood he could never wash away. In the wake of the massacre, when the streets of Paris had finally been washed of blood, another stain began to spread, one that no river could cleanse. It was not written in the official records of the court, but whispered in pamphlets, letters, and tavern songs. The rumor claimed that Charles IX had crossed the line that separates men from monsters. He had not only ordered death, people said, he had consumed it. Some swore he had drunk human blood. Others insisted he had demanded to taste the flesh of those slaughtered in his name. From these whispers emerged the chilling title that still shadows his memory, the Cannibal Prince. To understand how this story took hold, one must look at the tools of politics in the 16th century. The printing press had given new power to pamphleteers, and with religious war tearing Europe apart, words became weapons as sharp as any blade. Protestant writers seized the chance to turn Charles into a living symbol of Catholic brutality. By painting him as a man who dined on the entrails of his subjects, they gave their cause a monstrous enemy, a face to hatred itself. Ambassadors carried the tale to foreign courts, where it was repeated with relish. The more it spread, the less it mattered whether anyone had seen it with their own eyes. The horror of the massacre made the horror of cannibalism believable. Historians have wrestled with this rumor ever since. Some dismiss it as pure propaganda, a fabrication designed to blacken the Valois name and to justify rebellion. They point out that no official record, no diary from inside the French court, confirms such acts. Others, however, argue that stories like these are rarely born from nothing. Perhaps Charles, in a fit of rage or delirium, spoke words that were never meant to be taken literally. Perhaps his enemies clung to those words and sharpened them into a weapon that could pierce through time. In an age when madness, sin, and possession were easily confused, even a hint of strange behavior was enough to become legend. What is beyond doubt is the persistence of the tale. It has survived because it fits too perfectly with the image Europe wanted to remember. A massacre that claimed thousands of lives demanded a figure of ultimate guilt, and Charles, pale and trembling in the aftermath, was the obvious target. Whether he ever drank blood mattered less than the fact that people believed he could. The rumor was a mirror, reflecting not just one king, but a kingdom in decay. It cast the French court as a place where humanity itself had been devoured, where a monarch could be imagined as a beast cloaked in velvet. In this way, the legend became more powerful than the truth. The title Cannibal Prince has outlived the arguments of scholars because it resonates with the darkest fears of power unchecked. It reduces a troubled young king to an eternal image of corruption, and it makes the violence of his reign unforgettable. Even today, when historians remind us of the lack of evidence, the phrase still lingers, as if history itself prefers the grotesque story to the sober fact. So Charles IX remains suspended between man and monster. Perhaps he never tasted flesh, perhaps he never lifted a cup of blood. Yet the rumor endures because it tells a deeper truth. One that history could not bury. A throne can destroy the soul of the boy who sits upon it, until he is remembered not as a king of France, but as the Cannibal Prince. Behind the gilded walls of the Louvre, power was never a tranquil possession. It was a battlefield where alliances shifted as swiftly as candle flames in a draft. At the center of this storm stood Catherine de Medici, the Queen Mother whose hand steered the Valois dynasty through crisis after crisis. To her supporters, she was a shield, preserving the throne of her fragile son. To her enemies, she was a sorceress, a cold manipulator whose whispers led to rivers of blood. Catherine's reputation was forged not only by her decisions, but by the aura she carried. Italian by birth, raised in the traditions of Florence, she entered France as an outsider, mistrusted by nobles who saw her as foreign, and by clergy who whispered about her supposed taste for poison and astrology. Yet it was her political skill that allowed her to hold the crown in place after the deaths of her husband and her first son. She cultivated an image of a mother defending her children. But Europe preferred to imagine her as a spider spinning webs of murder. After the massacre of St. Bartholomew's Day, that image hardened. The world called her the architect of slaughter, the queen who had turned Paris into a graveyard. Within the French court, the atmosphere became suffocating. Nobles no longer gathered with trust, but with suspicion. Every banquet was a stage for hidden daggers. Every council meeting a chessboard of betrayals. It was said that Catherine could smile with one hand offering friendship, while the other concealed a blade. Charles IX, fragile and haunted, became less the king and more a symbol of what his court had become. The whispers that branded him the Cannibal Prince were not only about him. They were a reflection of a dynasty that seemed to feast upon itself. consuming its heirs with intrigue, paranoia, and hatred. Foreign ambassadors recorded their impressions with a mixture of horror and fascination. In Spain, the court of Philip II viewed the French monarchy as corrupted beyond repair, a dynasty rotting from the inside. In England, Elizabeth I and her ministers seized on the scandal, pointing to the French court as evidence of Catholic cruelty and instability. German princes spoke of France as a kingdom cursed, its rulers no longer human but predators clothed in velvet. The image of a cannibal king was less a literal charge than a metaphor made flesh, the embodiment of a monarchy that devoured its own people to survive. The cannibal legend thus grew in strength, not because anyone proved it, but because it symbolized a larger truth. The massacre had turned the French crown into a devourer, and Charles IX was its face. To say he drank blood was to give form to the way his court drained life from the nation. To say he ate flesh was to make visible the invisible truth that France itself was consuming its children in the name of faith and power. Inside the palace, Catherine continued to rule with cold determination. She arranged marriages, balanced factions, and silenced dissent. Yet every move she made seemed only to confirm her enemies' accusations. If she punished a noble, it was seen as vengeance. If she sought compromise, it was painted as deceit. In time, she became the perfect villain in the European imagination, the mother who raised a cannibal son. Her strength, instead of redeeming the crown, became the proof that the French monarchy no longer carried divine blessing. The court itself reflected this decay. Its feasts grew hollow, its ceremonies darker, as if gold and music were only masks stretched over rot. Visitors wrote of a palace where laughter sounded false and where the air itself seemed heavy with dread. The French royal family, meant to embody unity, looked instead like a house that had turned its knives inward. Brothers schemed against each other, courtiers plotted behind locked doors, and the king himself appeared less a ruler than a frightened witness. By the late 1570s, France was spoken of not as a kingdom, but as a warning. To foreign eyes, the Valois line was no longer a beacon of Renaissance culture, but a spectacle of decline. The figure of Charles IX, remembered in whispers as a cannibal, captured that decline more effectively than any decree or treaty. He was the symbol of a monarchy that had devoured itself and dragged a nation into the abyss with it. The darkness of the French court was not confined to its chambers. It radiated outward, shaping how Europe saw France for generations. A boy king haunted by massacre, a queen mother accused of sorcery, a dynasty that fed on its own blood. The story of the Cannibal Prince became the perfect metaphor, a grotesque image that told the truth not with facts, but with horror. And in that horror, the reputation of an entire court was sealed. The massacre of St. Bartholomew's Day had not only scarred the kingdom, it had shattered the king who bore its crown. In the years that followed, Charles IX slipped further into shadows, his body failing as surely as his spirit. Once thin and restless, he now wasted away, a monarch collapsing under the weight of his own name. By the mid-1570s, his illness could no longer be hidden. Physicians described a violent cough that racked his chest until blood poured from his lips. The royal apartments echoed with the sound of his lungs tearing themselves apart. Tuberculosis, then known as consumption, had taken hold, and it devoured him day by day. His sheets were stained crimson, his garments soaked through in nights of fever. Where courtiers once bowed to a young king, they now saw a figure pale as parchment, trembling and broken. The court tried to preserve appearances. Ceremonies continued. Ambassadors were received. But the truth could not be disguised. Charles was dying. His voice, once sharp in anger, weakened until it was little more than a rasp. He drifted between lucidity and delirium, muttering of rivers running red, haunted by faces that never left his sight. Servants reported his cries in the night. A man pursued not by enemies in flesh, but by memories. The crown on his head was no longer a symbol of authority. It was a reminder of the burden that had consumed him. There was a cruel symmetry in his decline. A king who had been branded the Cannibal Prince, accused of drinking the blood of his subjects, now drowned in his own. Each cough brought up more scarlet, as if his body itself had turned against him, punishing him for the slaughter he had presided over. To the eyes of his enemies, it seemed divine justice. To his mother, Catherine, it was the crumbling of everything she had fought to hold together. As his condition worsened, isolation deepened. Few dared to spend long hours with him. His temper flared without warning, and his weakness embarrassed those who still tried to honor him as king. In private, he faced the reality of his mortality with despair. At only 23 years old, the promise of youth had long since withered. He lived in the shell of a body that coughed, shivered, and bled, a body that betrayed him with every breath. In May 1574, Charles IX finally succumbed. Witnesses described his last days as a sequence of agony, his chest rattling with every inhalation, his bed soaked with sweat, his face gaunt and hollow. Some accounts say that he begged for forgiveness from God, racked by guilt for the massacre that had defined his reign. Others claim he left this world still tormented, his final moments filled with visions of blood. What all agree upon is the tragic image he left behind. He died not as a conqueror or a ruler in command, but as a young man consumed from within, abandoned by strength, abandoned by hope. His body was interred with royal honors, but the silence that followed carried little reverence. The name of Charles IX was already bound not to victories or laws, but to massacre and to rumor. In death, he became what legend demanded of him, a figure whose flesh had rotted under a curse of his own making. It was the ultimate irony. They had called him a cannibal, a prince who feasted on the lives of others. Yet in the end, it was his own body that devoured him, a slow, merciless undoing that left only bones and a legacy of horror. Charles IX of France departed this world at 23, leaving behind a throne that seemed less a seat of power than a seat of damnation. Death did not free Charles IX from his torment. If anything, it sealed him inside a narrative darker than any tomb. Other monarchs of France are remembered for victories in battle, for palaces built, or for laws written in their name. Charles left no such legacy. His reign is preserved not in triumph, but in massacre and rumor. The memory of a boy king whose crown became a shroud. In the centuries that followed, the name Charles IX was rarely spoken without blood. Chroniclers of the Reformation pointed to him as proof of Catholic cruelty. Writers of the Enlightenment cast him as a warning of how superstition and fanaticism can corrupt rulers. Even modern historians, cautious and precise, cannot write his story without lingering on the grotesque image of the Cannibal Prince. The legend became inseparable from the man. Inside France, his legacy was a dynasty weakened, a court divided, and a nation scarred. The Valois line stumbled on, but without strength. His brother Henry inherited a throne already poisoned, and the shadow of Saint Bartholomew, followed him wherever he went. The monarchy itself bore the mark of decay. And when the Bourbon line finally replaced it, the memory of Charles IX stood as one of the clearest symbols of why the Valois had fallen. To the wider world, Charles embodied the idea that a crown could devour its wearer. The rumors of cannibalism, whether true or false, expressed a deeper truth about kingship in an age of endless war. It was not only the people who were consumed. The throne itself demanded the life of the one who sat upon it. For Charles IX, this meant that his short years on earth ended not with glory, but with the slow unraveling of mind and body. His legend became a cautionary tale of power that corrodes, of duty that strips away humanity until nothing remains but the echo of screams and the taste of blood. Artists, pamphleteers, and storytellers kept the image alive because it carried weight beyond fact. The Cannibal Prince was not only a man, but a metaphor, the embodiment of a monarchy feeding on itself, a nation at war with its own soul. His story endures because it forces us to ask how far fear and hatred can twist those who rule, and how much of a human being must be lost before power itself is satisfied. In the end, his legacy is less about France in the 16th century than about the universal cost of power unchecked. He is remembered not as a statesman or as a reformer, but as a young man whose life collapsed into legend. To history, he remains a prisoner of his own myth, a figure forever trapped between fact and nightmare. They called him the Cannibal Prince, but the painful truth is that he was only a man, devouring himself before he ever had the chance to devour an empire. If you wish to walk deeper into these hidden corridors of history, to uncover the stories where crowns gleam with blood rather than gold, stay with us. Subscribe to our channel, and together we will continue to unveil the shadows of the past, where kings and queens are remembered not for their glory, but for the darkness that consumed them.